Hi guys, in this video I'm going to explain about Docker Swarm and Docker networks. Before explaining about Docker Swarm, I will explain Docker networks. Why? Because in Docker Swarm we will use Docker networks to establish a communication between different kinds of nodes. Okay, we will use different kinds of nodes in Docker Swarm. So to connect all these nodes we need Docker networks. So that's why before going to explain about the Docker Swarm, we should know about Docker networks. Okay, so here in Docker we have five kinds of networks. The first one is host network, and next one we have overlay network, and we have none network, we have macvlan network, and we have bridge network. Okay, these are the five networks we are going to use in Docker. Okay, so in which scenario we will use these networks? Every network will have some kind of scenario, so only in that scenario we can use these networks. So the first one, host network. We can use this host network in, for suppose I have my application running on Docker on some container, and I want to access some source files from my host computer. So we need to establish a communication or a connection between a host computer and my container, because I want to access some source files from my host computer. Okay, so whenever we want to use or whenever we want to access some outside applications from, so actually my application is running on Docker daemon and I want to access outside of the daemon, outside of the Docker daemon, then in that case we can use host. Okay, and we have overlay network. Overlay network will be used to establish a communication between two Docker daemons. Generally in Docker Swarm we will have different kinds of nodes. Okay, in every node there will be a Docker daemon. So between these Docker daemon we should have some network. That network will be the overlay network. Okay, in Docker Swarm generally we will use overlay network. And also there are some standalone containers, and these standalone containers will not be in Docker Swarm cluster. So in this case, if we want to get a communication or if we want to get some connection between the standalone containers and Docker Swarm services, we have to use overlay networks. And also another scenario we have, that is if we want to establish a communication between two standalone containers. In this scenario also we can use overlay network. Okay, the first one is between two Docker daemons, those who are in Docker Swarm, and also we can establish a connection between a Docker daemon and a standalone container, and also we can establish a connection between two standalone containers. Okay, and next one we have macvlan. This macvlan network will be used generally. If we use this macvlan network, it will assign a MAC address to the container. So whenever our Docker daemon wants to route a traffic to the container, it will use a macvlan address to route the traffic. Okay, so generally we don't use macvlan. Most of the cases we will use host, overlay, and bridge networks. Okay, some cases only we can, particular cases only we can use macvlan networks. Okay, so in macvlan network a MAC address will be assigned to the container. Based on that MAC address, the Docker daemon will route the traffic to the container. And next network will be a bridge network. Generally bridge network will be the default network for a container. Whenever we create a container, that the Docker will assign a default network for the container. So, and also if any container comes under this default network, then that container will have the same IP of host machine. For suppose I have host machine and I pull the base image from Docker Hub and I run that image and I got some container, and this container default will have some bridge network. So whenever we want to access this container, then this container will have automatically the same IP address of my host machine. We know that every container will have different IP addresses, okay, but when this container comes under bridge network, then it automatically have the same IP address of the host machine. Okay, so these are the 5 different kinds of Docker networks.